The helicopter blades slowed overhead as we touched down on the makeshift landing site. Freezing air rushed in when the pilot slid the door open. I pulled my jacket tighter, the cold biting through my layers despite my preparation. The Siberian mountains stretched around us, jagged and snow-capped, indifferent to our arrival. I grabbed my pack and hopped down onto frozen ground. My boots crunched on the thin layer of snow as I ducked under the still-spinning rotors. Richard was already waiting for me, his silver-gray hair whipping in the wind, a broad smile visible beneath his unkempt beard. "Sarah, you made it," he called out, rushing forward to greet me. He clasped my hand in both of his, the familiar calluses rough against my skin. "How was the flight?" "Long. Bumpy near the end," I said, glancing back at the helicopter. The pilot was unloading the last of our equipment. "Are we the last ones to arrive?" "Yes, the rest of the team got here yesterday. They've been setting up base camp while I've been..." He trailed off, his eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement. "Well, I've been making preliminary notes." I knew that look. It was the same one he'd worn in Turkey when we'd discovered the hidden chamber beneath the Byzantine church, and again in Peru when we'd uncovered the pre-Incan burial site. It meant Richard had found something big. "So this cave system," I said, following him toward a cluster of tents about 100 yards from the landing site. "You've been pretty vague about it in your emails." Richard laughed. "I wanted to see your face when you saw it for yourself. Trust me, it's better that way." The rest of the research team was gathered around a portable heater outside the main tent. I recognized two of them from previous expeditions: Elena, a geologist, and Marcus, a mapping specialist. The other three were new faces. Richard made quick introductions. "Everyone, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez, my former student and now one of the finest field archaeologists I've ever worked with." I nodded to the group, trying not to look as tired as I felt after 20 hours of travel. "Nice to meet you all." After a brief rest and some much-needed hot coffee, Richard gathered everyone together, his energy making him pace back and forth as he spoke. "We should head out now if we want to make good progress today," he said, checking his watch. "The entrance is about a 20-minute hike from here." We geared up with headlamps, backup lights, water, and basic tools. I noticed everyone packing heavier equipment than typical for an initial survey, which told me Richard had already been inside at least once. The hike took us up a narrow trail that wound between massive rock formations. The wind cut through the passes, making conversation difficult and encouraging a brisk pace. Richard led the way, occasionally pointing out geological features with the enthusiasm of a man half his age. "There it is," he finally said, stopping at a ridge and pointing toward what looked like a simple crack in the mountainside. "Not much to look at from here, is it?" He was right. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have walked right past. The entrance was just a dark slit between two rocky outcroppings, partially hidden by a stunted pine tree that somehow managed to grow in this harsh environment. "That's it?" I asked. "Your groundbreaking discovery?" Richard's eyes crinkled at the edges. "Don't judge a book by its cover, Sarah. You taught me that in Bangladesh, remember?" We approached the entrance, which looked even less impressive up close. It was narrow enough that we'd have to enter single file, and not much taller than my 5'7" frame. "I went in about 30 feet on my first visit," Richard explained as he adjusted his headlamp. "But I wanted to wait for the whole team before going deeper. The initial passage opens up dramatically after about 50 feet. He wasn't exaggerating. The cramped entrance tunnel required us to walk sideways in places, but then suddenly widened into a space where all 7 of us could stand comfortably. Our headlamp beams cut through the darkness, revealing a main corridor that sloped gently downward. "Let's stay together for now," Richard instructed. "Marcus, start mapping as we go. Elena, collect samples at the markers I placed yesterday." I ran my gloved hand along the wall beside me, noting its unusually smooth texture. "This doesn't feel like natural cave formation," I said. Richard beamed at me. "You noticed already. What else do you see?" I swept my light across the walls and ceiling. No stalactites, no stalagmites, none of the usual limestone formations you'd expect. I looked down at our feet. The floor is too even, and these walls, they're almost perfectly straight in sections. Exactly. Richard's voice echoed slightly in the space. Natural caves don't form like this, but who or what created it, and when? That's what we're here to find out. We moved deeper into the cave system, the main corridor occasionally branching into smaller passages that Richard marked for future exploration. The temperature dropped noticeably with each 100 feet of descent, until I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. "How far does this go?" I asked after we'd been walking for nearly an hour. "The radar shows chambers extending at least a mile into the mountain," Richard replied. "But there are some anomalies in the data that suggest even larger spaces beyond that." Another hour passed as we carefully made our way deeper. The smooth walls occasionally gave way to sections of rougher stone, only to return to that unsettling evenness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking through something designed rather than formed by natural processes. "Stop here," Richard finally called out, his voice carrying a note of reverence. He directed his light toward what was clearly an artificial doorway carved into the rock ahead of us. We gathered around him, our combined lights illuminating what was unmistakably the work of human hands, or at least intelligent hands. The opening was perfectly rectangular, with clean edges and what appeared to be decorative elements carved into the stone frame. I leaned closer to examine the markings. They weren't like any ancient script I recognized, not cuneiform, not hieroglyphics, not anything from known archaeological records. The patterns seemed almost geometric, with repeating symbols that might have been letters or numbers. "How old is this?" I asked, unable to keep the wonder from my voice. Richard shook his head. "Carbon dating from organic material I found embedded in the carvings suggests at least 12,000 years, but that can't be right." "Why not?" "Because whoever built this had tools that shouldn't have existed in that time period. Look at the precision of these cuts." He ran his fingers along the edge of the doorway. These weren't made with stone tools. The technology required for this level of stoneworking didn't exist until much later in human history. I stepped through the doorway, my light revealing a continuation of the passage beyond, but with even more pronounced architectural elements. The ceiling here was higher, with support structures that resembled pillars integrated into the walls. Richard gathered everyone around him, his expression serious despite his obvious excitement. "The ground-penetrating radar shows massive hollow spaces ahead. Based on the readings, we're talking about chambers hundreds of feet across. Whatever this is, it's enormous. Far too large and complex to be the work of any known ancient culture in this region." The rest of the team exchanged glances. This kind of discovery could rewrite archaeological textbooks. If Richard was right, and he usually was about these things, we were standing at the threshold of something that would shake the foundations of our understanding of ancient human capabilities. As Richard continued explaining the radar findings and outlining our exploration plan, I took a few steps ahead, running my light along the increasingly elaborate wall carvings. That's when I noticed something odd about the air. I took a deep breath, trying to identify what seemed out of place. There was a smell, faint but distinct, that didn't belong in a cave environment. It wasn't the damp earthiness I'd expect, nor the mineral scent common to limestone caverns. This was something different, a metallic tang that reminded me vaguely of copper or iron, but with an underlying note I couldn't quite place. I turned back to the group, wondering if anyone else had noticed it. Richard was still talking, gesturing enthusiastically as he pointed toward the darkness ahead of us. The rest of the team looked captivated by his words, their faces showing varying degrees of excitement and disbelief. I took another breath, confirming the strange scent. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the cave system, from whatever waited for us beyond. 30 minutes deeper into the passage, the tunnel widened suddenly. Our headlamp beams swept across the darkness ahead, then stopped moving altogether. I found myself frozen in place, struggling to process what I was seeing. "My God," I whispered. The narrow corridor had opened into an enormous cavern that stretched far beyond our lights, but that wasn't what stole my breath. Rising from the floor of the cave, illuminated by our combined beams, stood what could only be described as a city, not ruins, not foundations, a city. Stone buildings of various heights rose before us, many reaching at least 3 stories tall. Streets, actual paved streets, ran between them in patterns that seemed to follow some deliberate design. Spires and towers punctuated the skyline, their silhouettes sharp against the backdrop of the cavern wall. "Richard," I said, my voice barely audible, even to myself. "What is this?" He didn't answer immediately. When I turned to look at him, his face was transformed by wonder, his eyes wide and bright in the reflected light. He looked younger somehow, the decades of academic skepticism stripped away by what lay before us. "This shouldn't be here," he finally said. "This can't be here." The rest of the team clustered around us, their exclamations echoing in the vast space. Elena was already taking photographs, the flash illuminating sections of the nearest buildings in stark white light. Richard stepped forward onto what appeared to be the city's outskirts. "Everyone, check your oxygen levels. The air quality seems stable, but let's be cautious. Marcus, start mapping immediately. Elena, geological samples of both the cavern and the structures. The rest of you, document everything. And I mean everything." I followed Richard, my headlamp beam dancing across the facades of the nearest buildings. The architecture was like nothing I'd ever seen in my years of fieldwork. The structures weren't simply carved from existing rock formations. They appeared to have been built, stone by stone, using methods that displayed an advanced understanding of engineering. Most disturbing were the angles. My eyes struggled to follow the lines of the buildings, which seemed to bend in ways that didn't quite make sense. Corners that should have been right angles appeared slightly off, creating an unsettling effect when viewed as a whole. The geometric patterns adorning many of the facades seemed to shift subtly as our lights moved across them. "Look at this stonework," Richard called, running his hands along a perfectly fitted seam between massive blocks. "No mortar. Not a blade could fit between these stones. This level of precision, it's beyond what even the Inca achieved at Machu Picchu." I moved deeper into the city, drawn to what appeared to be symbols carved into the wall of a larger structure. They weren't hieroglyphics or cuneiform or any other ancient writing system I recognized. The symbols consisted of complex, geometric patterns interspersed with curved figures that almost, but not quite, resembled letters. "Can you make anything of these?" Richard asked, joining me. I shook my head. "Nothing familiar. They're not related to any known script. And they shouldn't be, given where we are," he replied. "There's no record of advanced civilization in prehistoric Siberia. Nothing that could explain this." We continued through what seemed to be a main thoroughfare. The buildings grew larger toward what I assumed was the center of the city. Many had doorways sized for human passage, though some openings were oddly proportioned, either too tall and narrow or too short and wide for comfort. Inside one structure, we found what appeared to be furniture, stone benches and tables, some with objects still resting on their surfaces. I approached one table where several ceramic-like vessels sat alongside tools made of an unfamiliar dark metal. "They left everything behind," I said, careful not to touch anything, as if they expected to return. Elena was examining a section of wall inside the same building. "The material composition is bizarre. This isn't just carved stone. There are trace elements I can't identify without proper analysis." As our exploration continued, the enormity of the discovery began to sink in. This city represented a civilization that had no business existing when and where it did. The team spread out across the central area, cameras flashing constantly as they documented every angle of the structures. I watched them moving like ants among the towers and buildings, their scale emphasizing the impressive size of the city. "Sarah, come look at this," Richard called from inside one of the larger buildings. I found him in what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. Stone tables lined the walls, covered with tools and unfinished objects. "They were creating something here," he said, gesturing to the workbenches, "and they stopped mid-project." He was right. Half-carved objects sat abandoned beside tools laid down, as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment. A piece of the dark metal was partially worked, the tool used to shape it still resting against it. "What happened to them?" I asked, more to myself than to Richard. He shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it? No signs of violence or disaster. No human remains. They just vanished." As evening approached, according to our watches, not the unchanging darkness of the cavern, Richard called the team together in what appeared to be a central plaza. The open space was surrounded by the tallest buildings we'd seen, their facades decorated with elaborate carvings. "We'll set up camp here," he announced. "The air quality remains stable, and the temperature is constant. We have enough supplies for 3 days of detailed investigation." The team busied themselves setting up portable lights and small tents. The equipment looked jarringly modern against the ancient stone surroundings. Once the lights were established, casting a wide circle of illumination around our camp, the true scale of the plaza became apparent. It was roughly circular, about 200 feet across, with radiating streets leading away in all directions. As the others prepared our camp, Richard pulled me aside to a spot near one of the larger buildings. "Do you understand what we've found?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "This changes everything, Sarah. Everything we thought we knew about human prehistory." I nodded, still trying to process the implications. If these dating estimates hold up, this predates Göbekli Tepe by 7,000 years. It shouldn't be possible. "The technical achievement alone is staggering," Richard continued, gesturing to the surrounding structures. "The precision cutting, the architectural complexity, the urban planning. Whoever built this had knowledge and capabilities we didn't think existed until the Bronze Age, at the earliest. And in Siberia, of all places," I added. "No known culture in this region had anything approaching this level of development." Richard grabbed my shoulders, his excitement palpable. "This will rewrite archaeological history, Sarah. Our names will be attached to the most significant discovery of the century." I should have shared his enthusiasm. This was the kind of find archaeologists dream about their entire careers. But something felt wrong. The strange angles of the buildings, the unfamiliar symbols, the complete absence of any human remains. It all added up to a picture that didn't fit any archaeological precedent I knew. "Something about this place doesn't feel right," I said quietly. Richard's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly. It's just, where are the people? Why would they abandon a city this elaborate? And these structures, they don't look like they were built for comfort or practicality. Some of the doorways, the room proportions, they're odd." "That's what makes it so fascinating," Richard insisted. "We're seeing a completely unknown architectural tradition, developed in isolation from everything we've studied before." I didn't argue further. Richard returned to the camp to help organize our equipment for the next day's exploration, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the plaza, examining the facades of the buildings that bordered it. In the portable light's glow, the carvings took on an even stranger appearance, their shadows creating patterns that seemed to move if I looked at them too long. The complete silence of the cavern was unnerving. No dripping water, no distant echoes, no sounds of animal life, just the occasional voices of the team members as they worked, sounds that seemed swallowed up by the vastness around us. I turned back toward our camp, brightly lit in the center of the ancient plaza. From this distance, the other team members looked small and vulnerable amid the looming stone structures. I couldn't shake the feeling that the empty windows of the buildings were watching us, dark rectangular eyes observing our intrusion after millennia of solitude. I returned to the camp as the others were finishing their setup, Marcus had his mapping equipment arranged on a folding table, already creating a preliminary layout of the city from our initial exploration. "The organization is remarkably sophisticated," he said as I approached. "The streets radiate from this central plaza like spokes, with connecting routes forming concentric circles. It's almost like they designed it to maximize efficiency of movement." I looked over his shoulder at the emerging map. "Any idea how large the city is?" "Based on what we've seen and the radar data, I'd estimate it covers at least half a mile in diameter. We've only explored about 20% of it so far." As the team settled in for the night, I found myself unable to relax. While the others talked excitedly about tomorrow's plans, I kept glancing at the dark buildings surrounding us. Our lights created a small island of illumination in the vast darkness, but beyond that circle, the city waited, silent, empty, and somehow watchful. I slept poorly in our makeshift camp. The silence of the underground city was too complete, lacking even the subtle sounds of air movement or distant water that usually filled natural caves. Every time I closed my eyes, the strange angles of the buildings seemed to shift behind my eyelids, geometric patterns rearranging themselves in ways that made no logical sense. When I finally gave up on sleep around 5 in the morning, I found Richard already awake, hunched over a portable table with his headlamp illuminating a notebook filled with sketches. He barely looked up when I approached, completely absorbed in whatever he was documenting. "You need to see this again," he said without preamble, reaching for his thermos of coffee. "The door we found last night. I've been working on the symbols." My mind flashed back to our discovery just before we'd set up camp. While the others had been mapping the central plaza, Richard and I had pushed further into the city, following what appeared to be a main thoroughfare that led straight from the central plaza toward the far cavern wall. There, set into the stone as if it had grown from the rock itself, we'd found an enormous door. "I still can't believe the size of that thing," I said, accepting the cup of coffee Richard offered me. 20 feet tall at least. 22 feet, 4 inches to be exact, Richard corrected, showing me his measurements. "And made of some material I've never encountered before. It looks like black stone, but the composition is unlike anything in our geological reference materials." The others began stirring around us, emerging from their tents with the bleary-eyed look of people who had slept as poorly as I had. Despite their fatigue, the excitement was palpable as Richard outlined our plan for the day. "The door is our priority," he announced. "Those symbols aren't just decorative, they're functional. I'm convinced they're part of a locking mechanism." Elena raised her hand. "Shouldn't we continue mapping the city first? We've barely covered 20% of it." Richard shook his head. "The city will still be here, but that door, whatever's behind it, could be the key to understanding who built this place and why they abandoned it." No one argued further. Richard had a way of making his priorities everyone's priorities. We quickly ate breakfast, gathered our equipment, and set off toward the far end of the city where the massive door awaited. The journey through the city looked different in the harsh light of our portable lamps than it had the evening before. The buildings seemed to loom taller, their shadows stretching in impossible directions across the paved streets. I found myself avoiding looking directly at certain facades where the geometric patterns seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. "The symmetry is all wrong," I muttered to myself as we walked. "What was that?" Richard asked from beside me. "These buildings," I explained. "They're balanced in a way that doesn't make visual sense, like they're adhering to some mathematical principle we don't understand." Richard nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Their concept of spatial relationships must have been fundamentally different from ours. Just another piece of evidence that we're dealing with a completely unknown civilization." We reached the door after 20 minutes of walking. It was just as imposing as I remembered, a vast slab of what appeared to be black stone, though with an unusual luster that made it seem almost wet in the light of our lamps. The surface was covered in intricate symbols carved in relief, forming patterns that sprawled across the entire surface. "I spent half the night studying these," Richard said, approaching the door with reverence. "They're not just decorative. Look here, and here." He pointed to several sections where the symbols formed concentric circles. "These are repeated patterns, but with subtle variations. I believe they're instructions." The rest of the team gathered behind us, cameras already clicking as they documented the door. Marcus began taking precise measurements while Elena collected sample scrapings from the material for later analysis. "So what do the instructions say?" I asked, studying the symbols. "They seem to absorb our light rather than reflect it, creating an unsettling depth effect." "I don't know exactly," Richard admitted, "but I noticed something interesting." He ran his fingers along one of the circular patterns. "Some of these symbols are raised slightly higher than others, and when I pressed on this one last night," he demonstrated, pushing firmly on a spiral-shaped carving. A soft click echoed through the chamber, making everyone freeze. "It moved," he said, excitement making his voice quiver slightly. "I've identified 7 such movable pieces, arranged in what I believe is a sequential pattern." "You're saying it's a combination lock?" I asked, both impressed and disturbed by the implication of such advanced engineering. "In essence, yes, and I think I've worked out the sequence based on how the symbols relate to each other." For the next hour, Richard carefully manipulated sections of the carved door, pressing symbols in various orders while consulting his notes. Each successful attempt produced another click, sometimes accompanied by a low grinding sound from within the door itself. The rest of the team watched in fascinated silence, documenting every move. I found myself hanging back, a growing sense of unease settling in my stomach. Something about the symbols made me deeply uncomfortable. They weren't like any writing system I'd ever studied, yet they conveyed meaning in a way that seemed almost familiar, as if they were tapping into some primal part of my brain that recognized their significance without understanding it. "This is the last one," Richard announced finally, his hand hovering over a symbol that resembled a spiral with 3 smaller circles embedded within it. "If my interpretation is correct, this should complete the sequence." He pressed the symbol firmly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a series of loud clicks echoed through the chamber in rapid succession, followed by a deep rumbling that seemed to come from within the door itself. Dust fell from the ceiling as the entire chamber vibrated. "Step back," I called, pulling Richard away from the door just as a grinding sound filled the air. The massive door began to move, sliding slowly into a recess in the wall with a sound like stone grinding against stone. The vibrations increased, making it difficult to stand steady. As the door opened, a rush of air flowed out from the chamber beyond, cold, stale air that carried a scent I couldn't identify. It wasn't the expected mustiness of a long-sealed space, but something sharper, metallic, with an underlying note that made me instinctively step backward. "Amazing," Richard whispered, moving forward despite my restraining hand on his arm. "Simply amazing." The door continued its slow retreat until it revealed a circular chamber beyond, easily 50 feet in diameter. Our light swept across the space, revealing walls of the same black material as the door, smooth and unadorned except for a single band of symbols that ran around the perimeter at eye level. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that drew our attention. A perfect circle, 30 feet across, opened in the floor, a pit whose edges were too precise to be natural. The pit was lined with the same black material as the walls, descending straight down into darkness. Richard was the first to approach it, his excitement overriding any caution. I followed more slowly, watching where I placed each foot on the smooth floor. We reached the edge together. The pit was like a perfect cylinder cut into the floor, its sides smooth and featureless. Richard directed his light downward, but the beam disappeared into absolute darkness, unable to reach the bottom. "Incredible," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "A perfect vertical shaft, at least several hundred feet deep." "Or more," I added, dropping a small stone into the darkness. We waited for the sound of impact, but none came. Either the pit was too deep for the sound to reach us, or something at the bottom had muffled the stone's landing. Richard turned to the team, who were still documenting the chamber from a cautious distance. "Marcus, bring the climbing equipment. Elena, set up a monitoring station here at the edge. We need to know what's down there." I looked at him sharply. "You're not seriously planning to go down right now?" "Of course I am," he replied, as if it were the most natural response in the world. "This is what we came for, Sarah. Discovery." While Marcus and 2 others retrieved the climbing gear from our packs, I studied the walls of the chamber more closely. Unlike the city buildings with their elaborate carvings, the chamber walls were almost completely smooth, broken only by that single band of symbols circling the room. The symbols matched those on the door but seemed to form a continuous narrative or instruction. These walls weren't carved, I realized aloud. They were formed as a single piece. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling no seams or joints. This isn't stone masonry. It's more like casting, like the entire chamber was poured as one piece. Richard barely registered my observation, too busy checking the climbing equipment Marcus had brought. He was already strapping himself into a harness, checking carabiners, and testing the strength of the ropes. "We'll anchor to these protrusions," he said, pointing to several knob-like features evenly spaced around the pit's edge. They blended so seamlessly with the floor that I hadn't noticed them initially. They appear to be designed specifically for securing ropes. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "Don't you think we should take more time to study this chamber before going down there? We have no idea what's below." He looked up from his equipment checks, his eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. "That's precisely why we need to go down, Sarah. Think about it. This entire city was built around this chamber. Whatever's down there is the reason for all of this." He gestured broadly at the walls around us. "It's the answer we're looking for." "We," I repeated, noting his choice of words. He straightened up, meeting my eyes directly. "Yes, we. I need you with me on this, Sarah. You see things I miss. You ask questions I don't think to ask." He lowered his voice further. "And frankly, you're the only one I trust to have my back if there's anything unexpected down there." I wanted to refuse. Every instinct I had was screaming that descending into that pit was a terrible idea. But Richard had been my mentor for over a decade. He had guided my career, supported my research, and given me opportunities no one else would have. I owed him. "Fine," I conceded. "But we go slowly, and at the first sign of danger, we come back up." Richard agreed readily, though I doubted he meant it. When he got this focused on a discovery, caution became an afterthought. The next 30 minutes were spent preparing for the descent. The ropes were secured to the anchor points, communications checks were performed with the radio units, and emergency protocols were established. The rest of the team would remain above to monitor our progress and maintain radio contact. As I finished adjusting my harness, I took one last look around the chamber. The perfect circle of the pit seemed to draw the eye inevitably toward it, as if it had been designed to be the focal point not just of this room, but of the entire underground complex. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to cross a threshold that wasn't meant to be crossed, at least not by us. Richard approached the edge, now fully equipped for the descent. His face was flushed with excitement as he performed a final check of his gear. "Ready?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. He was going down whether I was ready or not. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I moved to the edge beside him, I peered once more into the darkness below. Our flashlight beams still couldn't penetrate the depths, creating the unsettling illusion that the darkness was something tangible, something that could swallow light itself. Richard began securing his rappelling line, his movements practiced and efficient despite his excitement. "We'll maintain radio contact every 30 feet of descent," he instructed the team. "If you lose contact with us for more than 5 minutes, initiate emergency protocols." I made my own final preparations, trying to ignore the cold weight of dread settling in my chest. Whatever waited for us at the bottom of that pit, I was certain of one thing: it had been sealed away for a reason. The black void below us seemed to swallow the light from our headlamps. I gave the rope one last firm tug, testing the anchor points around the pit's edge. Despite Richard's confidence, my hand trembled slightly as I prepared to lower myself into the darkness. "I'll go first," Richard said, already swinging his legs over the edge. The eagerness in his voice bothered me. He was treating this like any other expedition, not the descent into an impossible structure built by an unknown civilization. "Wait," I said, adjusting my radio one last time. "Let's do a final comms check." Elena's voice crackled through clearly. "We read you. We'll monitor your descent from here." Richard didn't bother waiting for more assurances. He pushed off from the edge and began his descent, the beam of his headlamp growing smaller as he rappelled downward. I took a deep breath and followed, the rope sliding through my gloved hands as I eased myself into the pit. The walls of the shaft were unnaturally smooth, offering no handholds or features of any kind. Our lights revealed the same black material that made up the chamber above, but here it seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light, creating a disorienting effect as we descended. 30 feet, Richard called up, his voice echoing oddly in the vertical tunnel. I relayed the information to the surface team, receiving a crackled acknowledgement. The descent continued in near silence, broken only by our occasional depth calls and the soft sounds of our equipment. After about 20 minutes, I noticed the air changing, growing colder and somehow thicker, as if it contained particles too fine to see but substantial enough to feel in my lungs. "The air quality is changing," I reported into my radio. "It's getting harder to breathe." Static answered me. "Surface team, do you copy?" I tried again, receiving only more static in response. "Richard, I'm losing contact with the surface." "Expected at this depth," he called back, his voice strangely muffled despite being only about 50 feet below me. "We'll regain contact when we return to the surface." His casual dismissal of our lost communication link disturbed me, but I continued down, focusing on the methodical movements of the descent. The cold intensified as we went deeper, a dry, penetrating chill unlike anything I'd experienced in natural caves. My breath clouded in front of my face, the vapor looking oddly solid in the beam of my headlamp. After what seemed like an eternity of darkness and silence, Richard's voice echoed up from below. "I've reached the bottom. Come down. You need to see this." I quickened my pace slightly, eager to reach solid ground again. When my feet finally touched the floor, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Richard was already unclipping from his rope, his headlamp beam sweeping across our surroundings. We stood in a circular chamber similar to the one above, but smaller, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. The walls were lined with the same black material, and like the chamber above, they were largely featureless, except for a band of symbols running around the perimeter. "We must be at least 500 feet down," I said, checking my equipment. The descent took nearly an hour. Richard wasn't listening. He had already moved to the far side of the chamber, where his light had found something that made him freeze in place. I joined him, my own light joining his to illuminate what lay before us. Another door. This one was smaller than the massive entrance above, perhaps 10 feet tall, but made of the same black material. Its surface was covered in similar symbols, arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes if I tried to follow them too closely. "It's another locking mechanism," Richard said, examining the door with practiced eyes. "Similar to the one above, but more complex." I tried the radio again, hoping to update the surface team, but received only static. The thick air seemed to press against my skin now, making each breath slightly labored. "We should head back up," I suggested, but Richard was already running his fingers over the symbols, muttering to himself as he traced their patterns. "The sequence is different, but the underlying logic appears similar," he said, pressing one of the raised symbols. A soft click echoed through the chamber, followed by a low hum that seemed to come from within the door itself. I watched as Richard worked methodically through what he believed to be the correct sequence, each successful press producing another click until finally, after the 7th symbol, the door began to move. It slid sideways into the wall with a grinding sound that vibrated through the floor beneath our feet. Cold air rushed through the opening, carrying that same metallic scent I'd noticed earlier, but stronger now, with undertones that made me want to cover my nose and mouth. Richard didn't seem to notice or care, already stepping through the doorway with his light leading the way. "Richard, wait," I began, but he was already through. I had no choice but to follow. Beyond the door stretched a long, straight corridor that extended far beyond the reach of our lights. The ceiling was lower here, perhaps 12 feet high, and the walls were lined with what appeared to be small windows at regular intervals. Each window was covered with bars made of the same black material as everything else. The corridor was wide enough for 4 people to walk side by side, its floor perfectly level and its ceiling unnaturally straight. The air was even colder here, and that strange scent grew stronger with each step we took. "This is incredible," Richard said, his voice hushed with awe. "The engineering required to build this at such depth. It shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology." He moved forward eagerly, examining the construction of the corridor while I approached one of the barred windows with growing unease. The opening was about 3 feet square, set at eye level in the wall. The bars were spaced about 4 inches apart, creating a grid pattern that allowed a clear view into the space beyond. I raised my light, aiming it through the bars, and felt my entire body go rigid with shock. Inside was a chamber roughly 15 feet square, and in that chamber was something. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The creature, because it was clearly alive, filled most of the space, its massive body folded in on itself as if to fit within the confines of the cell. It had multiple limbs, I couldn't count how many, arranged in a way that defied any biological classification I knew. Its skin, if that was the right word, was a mottled pattern of colors that seemed to shift subtly, even as it remained perfectly still. But it was the creature's features that made my blood turn to ice. Where a head should have been, there was a collection of sensory organs unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not eyes or ears as we would understand them, but structures that suggested functions I couldn't begin to comprehend. Parts of it appeared crystalline, reflecting my light in prismatic patterns, while other sections seemed to absorb the light completely. The thing was motionless, but unmistakably alive. I could see a subtle movement that suggested breathing, creating a barely perceptible vibration that I could feel through the floor beneath my feet. "Richard," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "Come here. Now." He must have heard something in my tone because he joined me immediately, raising his own light to peer through the bars. I heard his sharp intake of breath as he registered what we were looking at. "My God," he breathed. "What is it?" "I don't know," I said, stepping back from the window. "But I think we're in some kind of prison." Richard moved to the next window, then the next, confirming that each contained a similar creature, though with variations in size and features that suggested different specimens rather than a uniform species. "This can't be real," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was right in front of us. These things, they're not from Earth. They can't be. I looked down the corridor, which stretched far into the darkness. "How many are there?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Dozens," Richard replied, his light probing the distance. "Maybe hundreds. The corridor seems to extend much further than our lights can reach." As the implications sank in, a cold fear gripped me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Richard, we need to leave. Now." But he wasn't listening. He had moved back to the first window and was examining the creature with scientific curiosity, his initial shock giving way to fascination. "Think about what this means, Sarah," he said, his voice growing animated. "An advanced civilization discovered these beings thousands of years ago. They built this entire complex to contain them, study them, perhaps. This rewrites everything we thought we knew about ancient history." "That's exactly why we need to leave," I insisted, grabbing his arm. "This place was sealed for a reason. Whatever these things are, someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure they stayed locked away. Richard pulled his arm free, irritation flashing across his face. We can't just walk away from the most important archaeological discovery in human history because you're scared. I'm not scared, I lied. I'm being rational. We have no idea what these creatures are capable of or why they're imprisoned here. We need to report this properly, bring in experts. We are the experts, Richard interrupted, turning back to the window. No one else has the background to understand what we're seeing here. We need to document everything before we leave. I knew that tone. When Richard got like this, there was no reasoning with him. The thrill of discovery overrode everything else: caution, common sense, even self-preservation. I approached another window, forcing myself to look at the being inside. This one was smaller than the first, but no less alien. Its body structure seemed to defy the laws of biology as I understood them, with sections that appeared solid giving way to portions that seemed almost fluid. Like the first, it remained motionless, except for the subtle rhythm of what I assumed was breathing. "How old do you think they are?" I asked, trying to approach the situation analytically, despite the fear knotting my stomach. Richard shook his head. Impossible to say without proper testing, but given the age of the structure, they must be ancient. Thousands of years, at minimum. And they're still alive, I said, the implications making me dizzy. Nothing should be able to survive that long. Nothing we know of, Richard corrected, moving further down the corridor. But these beings clearly don't follow the biological rules we understand. I followed him reluctantly, noting that the corridor curved slightly as we progressed, making it impossible to see its full extent. Each window we passed revealed another creature, each as bizarre and unnatural as the last. Some were larger, nearly filling their cells completely, while others were more compact, their forms suggesting different types or perhaps different stages of development. The architectural precision is extraordinary, Richard noted, running his hand along the perfectly smooth wall between windows. No seams, no joints. It's as if the entire structure was formed as a single piece. I was about to respond when a low vibration passed through the floor, so subtle I might have imagined it if Richard hadn't paused as well. "Did you feel that?" I asked. He nodded, looking concerned for the first time since we'd entered the corridor. "Probably just settling. These structures are thousands of years old after all." I wasn't convinced. "Richard, I really think we should go back. We can return with more equipment, better communications." "Just a little further," he insisted, already moving ahead. "I want to see how far this corridor extends." I stayed close behind him, my unease growing with each step. The vibration came again, stronger this time, accompanied by a deep sound at the very edge of hearing, more felt than heard, like the lowest note of a massive pipe organ. "Richard, stop," I said, grabbing his arm again. "Something's happening." This time he didn't pull away. He stood perfectly still, head cocked slightly as he listened. The vibration returned, definitely stronger, and with it came a change in the air pressure that made my ears pop painfully. "We need to leave," I said, no longer caring if my fear was obvious. "Now." Richard hesitated, clearly torn between his scientific curiosity and the growing signs of danger. Before he could decide, the choice was made for us. The rumbling that had been building beneath our feet suddenly intensified, changing from a subtle vibration to a violent shaking that threw us both against the corridor wall. A deep, grinding sound filled the air as the ancient structure protested against forces it was never designed to withstand. "Earthquake!" Richard shouted, struggling to stay on his feet as the floor bucked beneath us. I reached for him, trying to pull him back toward the entrance, but the shaking intensified, sending us both to our knees. Dust and small fragments of stone began to fall from the ceiling as the entire corridor swayed like a ship in heavy seas. The creatures in their cells remained motionless despite the chaos, but I swore I could feel their attention sharpening, focusing on us as if they were suddenly aware of our presence in a way they hadn't been before. A large chunk of ceiling crashed to the floor between us, forcing me to roll away from Richard. The lights on our helmets created wild, disorienting patterns as we struggled to regain our footing. "Richard!" I called out, my voice barely audible over the rumbling that now filled the entire structure. I caught a glimpse of him through the falling debris, his face a mask of shock and fear as he realized the enormity of what was happening. The quake was growing stronger by the second, the ancient stones around us beginning to crack and split after millennia of stability. The floor beneath my feet suddenly heaved upward, throwing me hard against one of the barred windows. Through the bars, I found myself face to face with the creature inside, now stirring from its stillness, its alien features seeming to focus directly on me. In that moment, as the earthquake tore at the ancient prison around us and stone rained from above, I knew with terrible certainty that whatever had been sealed away here was about to be set free. I came back to myself with my face pressed against cold stone. My head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when I tried to move, pain shot through my right side. I lay still, trying to piece together what had happened and where I was. The earthquake, the prison corridor, the creatures, Richard. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dim light of my headlamp, which had somehow stayed on despite everything. I was back in the circular chamber at the bottom of the pit, the one we'd arrived in before entering the corridor with the prison cells. My gear lay scattered around me. My pack had torn open, spilling tools and supplies across the smooth black floor. "Richard?" I called, my voice weak and hoarse. The sound echoed in the chamber, then faded to nothing. "Richard!" I tried to sit up, gritting my teeth against the pain in my ribs. Probably cracked, not broken, I told myself, though I had no way to be sure. My left hand came away sticky with blood when I touched my forehead. A shallow cut, not serious, but head wounds always bled dramatically. My radio hung from my belt, the casing cracked. I tried it anyway, pressing the talk button with a shaking thumb. "Surface team, do you copy? Elena? Marcus? Anyone?" Nothing but static answered me. I tried again on different channels with the same result. Either the radio was damaged beyond function, or the signal couldn't penetrate the stone above me. I looked up, trying to spot the ropes we'd used to descend. They were gone. The perfect circle of the pit stretched above me, disappearing into darkness. How was I going to climb out without ropes? More importantly, how had I gotten back here? The last thing I remembered was being thrown against the barred window, coming face to face with one of those creatures as the earthquake tore the ancient structure apart. I had no memory of returning to this chamber. Had I been knocked unconscious and somehow dragged myself here? Or had something moved me? I pushed the thought away. I needed to find Richard. Using the wall for support, I got to my feet and took inventory of my condition. Besides the likely cracked ribs and the cut on my forehead, I had various scrapes and bruises, but nothing that would prevent me from moving. My water bottle had survived intact, and I took a careful sip, trying to clear the dust from my throat. The doorway to the prison corridor stood open across the chamber, just as we'd left it. Gathering what useful supplies I could find, I stuffed them into what remained of my pack and made my way slowly toward the door. The corridor beyond had partially collapsed. Huge chunks of the ceiling had fallen, and cracks ran through the walls like lightning bolts. Dust hung thick in the air, making it hard to breathe. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth as I picked my way carefully over the debris. "Richard!" I called again, louder this time. My voice bounced back at me from the damaged walls. I had gone about 30 feet when I saw him. A large section of the ceiling had come down directly on top of him, crushing him against the floor. Only his upper body was visible, his head turned to the side, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something. Blood pooled beneath him, black in the beam of my headlamp. "No, no, no," I whispered, scrambling over the rubble toward him. "Richard." I knew he was dead before I reached him. The weight of the stone had crushed his chest and lower body. His eyes stared sightlessly, his mouth open in what might have been surprise or pain. I touched his neck anyway, searching for a pulse I knew wouldn't be there. His skin was already cool. I sat back on my heels, shock washing over me in a wave that left me dizzy and nauseous. Richard was dead. My mentor, my friend, the man who had shaped my career and brought me to this godforsaken place. He was gone. A sudden sound from deeper in the corridor snapped me back to reality, a grinding, shifting noise that might have been settling stone or might have been something else entirely. I remembered the creatures in their cells and the terrible certainty I'd felt that they were about to be freed. I needed to get out of here. Now. I forced myself to search Richard's body, hating myself for it, but knowing I needed anything useful he might have been carrying. His pack was crushed beneath him, but I managed to retrieve his water bottle, a spare flashlight, and a small emergency kit from his pocket. I also took his watch, an expensive model with a built-in compass that might help me navigate. "I'm sorry," I whispered, closing his eyes with shaking fingers. "I'm so sorry." Another rumble shook the corridor, sending a fresh shower of dust and small stones raining down. The structure was still unstable. I had no time to grieve, no time to try to recover his body. I had to find a way out before the whole place came down on top of me. I retreated to the circular chamber, trying to think logically, despite the panic clouding my mind. The ropes were gone, so I couldn't climb back up the way we'd come down. The prison corridor was partially collapsed and potentially full of freed alien creatures. What other options did I have? I examined the chamber more carefully, running my hands along the walls, looking for anything that might help me. On my third circuit, I felt it. A slight draft of air coming from a crack in the wall that I hadn't noticed before. The crack was narrow, barely visible in the black material of the wall, but it ran from floor to ceiling. I pressed my face close to it, feeling the faint movement of air against my cheek. The crack must connect to somewhere else, somewhere that might lead upward. Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger than the last. A large chunk of the ceiling broke loose and smashed into the floor not 10 feet from where I stood. I had no choice. It was the crack or nothing. The opening was narrow, too narrow for Richard to have fit through, but I might just manage it. I shed my pack, keeping only the most essential items which I stuffed into my pockets. Richard's flashlight, both our water bottles, the emergency kit, and a small pry bar I'd had in my own pack. I turned sideways and began to work my way into the crack. The edges of the stone scraped against my chest and back, but I could move. Inch by inch, I squeezed deeper into the narrow passage, using the pry bar to test the stability of the stone ahead of me. After about 20 feet, the crack widened enough that I could face forward. I played my light along the walls, seeing that I was now in what appeared to be a natural fault line in the rock, not part of the constructed chamber. The passage angled upward at a steep incline, offering a potential route toward the surface. I began to climb. The stone was rough enough to provide handholds, but loose in places, crumbling under my weight and sending cascades of small rocks tumbling back the way I'd come. Every movement sent pain shooting through my injured ribs, but I kept going, driven by the need to escape and the fear of what might be happening in the prison corridor behind me. The climb was agonizingly slow. Sometimes the passage narrowed again, forcing me to squeeze through tight sections where my chest scraped painfully against the stone. Other times it widened into small chambers where I could rest briefly before continuing upward. I had no way to track time except by the gradual depletion of my water supply, but it must have been hours. My muscles burned with exhaustion, and the cut on my forehead had opened again, sending blood trickling into my eye. I wiped it away and kept climbing, focusing on finding the next handhold, the next foothold, anything to take me one step higher. A distant rumble reached me through the stone, reminding me that the structure below was still unstable. Was the entire cave system collapsing? Had the surface team made it out safely? Questions without answers drove me upward with renewed desperation. I reached a section where the passage split in two. I stopped, trying to determine which branch to take. Both angled upward, but one seemed slightly steeper. I chose that one, hoping it would lead me more directly toward the surface. The passage narrowed again, then suddenly opened into a larger space, a natural cave about 20 feet across, with a ceiling too high for my light to reach. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, the first natural sound I'd heard since entering the underground city. I collapsed against the wall, gulping air into my burning lungs. My hands were raw and bleeding from the climb, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I allowed myself a careful sip of water, rationing what little remained. As I rested, another aftershock rumbled through the mountain. Rocks tumbled from above, forcing me to scramble for cover. When the shaking stopped, I found my path forward blocked by fallen debris. I'd have to find another way. The next hour was a nightmare of false starts and dead ends. Each time I thought I'd found a viable route, another tremor would send me backtracking to avoid cave-ins. My water supply dwindled dangerously, and the pain in my ribs grew sharper with each labored breath. Finally, I discovered a narrow chimney that seemed to lead upward. The climb was treacherous. Loose rock gave way under my hands, and twice I nearly fell when handholds crumbled. My progress slowed to inches at a time, testing each hold before trusting it with my weight. I emerged into what appeared to be a side corridor of the main cave system. This wasn't the way Richard and I had come down. I must be in a completely different section of the caverns. I stumbled forward, my light sweeping across familiar black stone walls. I was back in the underground city, though in a part we hadn't explored before. The building around me had partially collapsed, with large sections of the ceiling missing and walls cracked and leaning at dangerous angles. I picked my way through the rubble of what had once been an intact structure. Through a collapsed wall, I could see the main thoroughfare of the city, now barely recognizable. Many of the buildings had been reduced to piles of stone, and huge cracks ran through the cavern floor. Dust still hung thick in the air, suggesting the destruction was recent. The earthquake must have devastated the entire complex, not just the prison level below. As I emerged onto what remained of the main street, I listened intently for any signs of the team. Nothing but the occasional sound of settling stone reached my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing through the ruined city. "Is anyone here?" No response. Had they already evacuated? I checked Richard's watch. I'd been climbing for nearly 2 hours. If the surface team had felt the same tremors I had, they might have been forced to leave for their own safety. I tried to orient myself, looking for landmarks among the destruction. After several wrong turns and dead ends, I finally recognized a distinctive archway that led toward the main entrance passage. Hope surged through me. I was on the right track. My relief was short-lived. As I approached the entrance tunnel, another powerful aftershock hit. I threw myself against a wall as chunks of ceiling crashed down around me. When the dust cleared, I saw that part of the passage ahead had collapsed. I approached cautiously, playing my light over the fallen rocks. There was a gap, narrow, but possibly wide enough for me to squeeze through. Beyond it, I could see the continuation of the passage. Before I could attempt it, another tremor shook the cavern. I retreated as more of the ceiling came down, narrowing the gap even further. This was going to be close. I waited, counting to 100 to make sure no more immediate aftershocks were coming. Then I approached the blockage again, assessing the best way through. The gap was barely wide enough for my shoulders. I'd have to remove my jacket and push it ahead of me. I did so, wincing as the cold air hit my sweat-soaked shirt. Then I began to work my way into the opening, turning sideways to present the narrowest profile possible. Halfway through, I felt the mountain tremble again. Dust and small stones showered down on me as I frantically pushed forward, ignoring the pain as sharp edges tore at my skin. A larger rock struck my shoulder, nearly causing me to lose my balance. I lunged forward with the last of my strength, tumbling through the gap just as the passage behind me collapsed completely. I lay there gasping, covered in dust and blood, as the rumbling subsided. When I could move again, I retrieved my jacket and continued forward, now acutely aware that my path back was sealed. It was forward, or nothing. The next section of the passage was relatively intact, though cracks ran through the walls and ceiling. I moved as quickly as I dared, stopping to take shelter whenever aftershocks hit. My progress was painfully slow, but I was moving in the right direction. Another hour passed as I navigated the treacherous passage. Twice more I had to find ways around collapsed sections, once crawling through a space so tight I wasn't sure I'd make it. My water was gone, my mouth dry with dust and thirst. Finally, I saw a faint glow ahead, natural light filtering in from the entrance. I staggered forward, hope giving me a final burst of energy. The last 100 feet were the hardest. A major collapse had left the passage floor covered in jagged rubble that shifted treacherously underfoot. I fell twice, reopening the cut on my forehead and adding fresh scrapes to my already battered body. And then I was through, emerging into the outer cave where daylight streamed in from the entrance 50 feet ahead. The air was cleaner here, free of the choking dust that filled the city cavern. I walked the final steps on my own, staggering out into the open air of the mountainside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, breathing deeply despite the pain in my ribs. The campsite was deserted. Equipment cases lay scattered around, some open and emptied in what appeared to have been a hasty evacuation. The helicopter was gone. They had left without me. I couldn't blame them. After the first major tremors, they must have tried to contact us. When they couldn't reach us by radio, they would have had to make the difficult decision to evacuate before the mountain became too unstable for the helicopter to approach. I stumbled to what remained of the supply cache. Someone, Elena probably, had left an emergency pack prominently displayed on a rock. Inside, I found a thermal blanket, energy bars, a full water bottle, and most importantly, an emergency beacon. I activated the beacon immediately, knowing it would be hours before rescue could arrive. Night was falling, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I found a relatively sheltered spot near the cave entrance and wrapped myself in the thermal blanket, rationing the water and food. As darkness fell completely, I stared up at the stars appearing one by one in the clear Siberian sky. Richard was dead, buried in that impossible city beneath the mountain. I was alone with the knowledge of what we had found and what we had perhaps unleashed. Behind me, a final massive tremor shook the mountain. I turned to see rocks tumbling down from above the cave entrance, sealing it completely. Whatever lay below would remain hidden, at least for now. I huddled deeper into my blanket, shivering not just from the cold, but from the memory of those alien eyes staring at me through the prison bars. As I waited for rescue, I began to consider what I would tell the authorities when they arrived. The truth seemed impossible. Who would believe me? Some discoveries, I realized, were perhaps better left buried. I curled tighter into the thermal blanket as another blast of wind cut through my shelter. The emergency supplies weren't meant for extended survival in Siberian winter conditions, just enough to keep someone alive until rescue arrived. The beacon beside me blinked steadily, its small red light my only companion in the darkness. The night stretched endlessly. I couldn't sleep, not with the cold working its way through the blanket, and my thoughts cycling between Richard's crushed body and those alien creatures staring at me through their prison bars. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again, those shifting, impossible anatomies that defied classification. By morning, my water was half gone, and I'd eaten one energy bar, trying to ration what little I had. The sun rose over the mountains, offering light but little warmth. My fingers had turned an alarming shade of white, despite keeping them tucked against my body. I tried moving them periodically, wincing at the pins and needles sensation that followed. The second day passed in a blur of pain and cold. I talked to myself sometimes, just to hear a human voice. Sometimes I talked to Richard, telling him how angry I was that he'd pushed us deeper into that nightmare. My ribs throbbed with each breath, and the cut on my forehead had crusted over with blood and dirt. As night fell again, I began to wonder if the beacon was working at all. What if it had been damaged? What if no one was looking for me? The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset, and I couldn't stop shaking. I tucked myself into a small depression near where the cave entrance had been, trying to use the rock face as a windbreak. At some point during that second night, I started hallucinating. I saw the walls of the chamber moving around me, symbols sliding across stone surfaces. I heard whispers in a language I couldn't understand but somehow recognized, and I felt watched, the same sensation I'd experienced in the underground city, as if something ancient and patient had turned its attention toward me. When morning came, I was semi-conscious, my thoughts scattered and slow. I didn't feel cold anymore, which some distant part of my brain recognized as a bad sign. The beacon continued its steady blinking, but I no longer believed help was coming. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember was a sound cutting through the silence, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. Instead, I dragged myself toward the clearing where our camp had been, leaving the thermal blanket behind in my confusion. The wind whipped snow into small cyclones as the helicopter descended. Figures jumped out before it fully landed, running toward me with gear and medical equipment. Someone wrapped me in blankets while another checked my vitals. Their voices sounded far away, distorted as if coming through water. "Found her. She's alive. Severely hypothermic. Need to move quickly." I tried to tell them about Richard, about the city, about what was imprisoned beneath the mountain, but my words came out slurred and disconnected. The prison. They're not. Richard is dead. The earthquake let them out. A medic shined a light in my eyes, his face grim. "She's delirious. Let's get her on board now." They lifted me onto a stretcher and carried me to the helicopter. The sudden warmth inside made my skin burn as circulation returned to my extremities. Someone inserted an IV into my arm, while another cut away my frozen outer layers of clothing. Through the helicopter window, I could see the mountain where the cave entrance had been. It looked ordinary, unchanged, as if it wasn't hiding impossible secrets beneath its surface. As we lifted off, I felt a surge of relief mixed with something darker. Whatever had been imprisoned below was still there, sealed away again by the final cave-in. But for how long? The flight passed in a haze of pain medication and warming procedures. I drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to catch fragments of conversation between the rescue team members. Only survivor. Bodies of the others. Completely collapsed. I wanted to correct them, to explain that the others had escaped before me, but speaking required too much effort. Besides, a growing part of me recognized that the less I said, the better. Who would believe what I'd seen? What would happen if I told the truth? We landed at a military hospital in Norilsk. The next several days blurred together, doctors examining my injuries, nurses changing bandages, police and government officials asking preliminary questions that I answered vaguely, claiming confusion and trauma. My physical injuries were treated efficiently: 3 cracked ribs, frostbite on my fingers and toes, though thankfully not severe enough to require amputation, the gash on my forehead that needed 12 stitches, and various cuts and bruises from my escape through the collapsing cave system. The hypothermia had been the most immediately dangerous condition, but they'd caught it in time. What the doctors couldn't treat was what I'd seen. Each night, I woke gasping from dreams of those creatures stirring in their cells, of walls that shouldn't exist, of Richard's sightless eyes staring at nothing as his blood pooled beneath him. On my 4th day in the hospital, I learned the rest of our team was safe. They'd evacuated after the first major tremors when they lost contact with Richard and me. Elena had insisted on leaving the emergency pack before they were forced to flee as the mountainside became increasingly unstable. I felt an overwhelming gratitude toward her for that decision, which had likely saved my life. Once I was stable enough for extended conversation, the questions began in earnest. 2 investigators from the Russian Federal Security Service arrived, along with a representative from our university and someone from the American Embassy. They set up recording equipment in my hospital room and began what would become days of detailed interviews. Dr. Martinez, The older FSB investigator began. "We need to understand exactly what happened in that cave system. Start from the beginning and tell us everything you remember." I had made my decision during those long hours waiting for rescue. Some truths were too dangerous, too unbelievable. If I told them about the underground city, the prison, the creatures, I'd be dismissed as delusional at best, or locked away for more intensive questioning at worst. So I lied, not completely, but selectively. Dr. Grayson identified what he believed was an unusual cave formation in the satellite imagery, I explained, keeping my voice steady. We assembled the team to investigate potential archaeological significance. The initial exploration showed promising signs of ancient human habitation, some carved stonework, possible tool markings. The investigators nodded, taking notes. I continued, describing a conventional cave exploration gone wrong. We descended deeper into the system than originally planned. Richard was excited about some unusual formations. Then the first tremors hit. I paused, letting my genuine grief show. We were separated from the main team. The passages started collapsing around us. Richard was crushed by falling stone. I couldn't reach him in time. The memory of his body beneath the massive ceiling section wasn't a lie, at least. The tears that came to my eyes were real. I tried to find my way back, but the main passage had collapsed. I had to find another route out, which took hours of climbing through unstable side passages. By the time I reached the surface, the rest of the team had evacuated. "And what about these ancient structures Dr. Grayson was so interested in?" the university representative asked. "Did you find anything significant before the earthquake?" I shook my head. Some promising signs, but nothing conclusive. The collapse destroyed any evidence we might have documented properly. They questioned me for hours each day, probing for inconsistencies, seeking details about the cave system's layout, asking about Richard's final moments. I kept my answers simple, consistent, and vague where necessary. My genuine trauma and injuries made my memory lapses believable. After a week, they seemed satisfied. The official report classified the incident as a tragic climbing accident during routine cave exploration. Richard's body remained unrecoverable due to the extensive collapse of the cave system. The university arranged for a memorial service, which I attended in a wheelchair, still too weak to stand for long periods. 3 weeks after my rescue, I returned to Boston. My apartment felt alien and too quiet. I jumped at shadows and couldn't sleep without the lights on. Colleagues treated me with kid gloves, offering condolences for Richard and assurances that I could take all the time I needed to recover. I tried to resume my teaching and research duties, but found myself unable to focus. How could I lecture undergraduates about Mesopotamian settlement patterns when I'd seen evidence that would rewrite human history? How could I care about pottery shards from the Bronze Age after what I'd witnessed in that mountain? During sleepless nights, I pieced together theories about what we had found. The underground city had been built with technology that shouldn't have existed 12,000 years ago. Precision stone cutting, advanced engineering, urban planning. Its builders had constructed it specifically as a containment facility for those creatures. But who were they? And where had they gone? I scoured archaeological journals and fringe publications alike, looking for any reference to similar findings, impossible structures, anomalous technological evidence from prehistory. I found scattered reports, most dismissed as pseudoscience or hoaxes, but some contained details that resonated with what I'd seen. Precisely cut stone that defied period tools, mathematical knowledge encoded in ancient structures that seemed too advanced, legends of keepers who guarded against ancient evils. One night, staring at my living room wall covered with notes and printouts, I understood what must have happened. Some advanced civilization, whether human or otherwise, had discovered these creatures. They built the underground complex to contain and study them. But something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of destroying the beings, which might have been impossible, they sealed them away and abandoned the site, perhaps leaving warnings that were lost to time or deliberately destroyed by those who came after. The earthquake had potentially compromised that ancient prison. Had any of the creatures escaped? Or were they still contained, stirring in their cells, waiting for the next unwitting explorers to find them? I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that I carried a terrible secret. Knowledge that humanity once faced something so alien, so dangerous, that an entire advanced civilization had abandoned their city rather than continue to coexist with it. Some mornings I woke convinced I should tell someone, assemble a team, return with proper equipment, document everything scientifically. But each time I considered it, I remembered the feeling that had overwhelmed me in that corridor, the sense that these beings were fundamentally wrong, that their very existence violated something essential about our reality, and so I remained silent, carrying the weight of what I knew alone. My colleagues attributed my changed demeanor to trauma and grief. They weren't wrong, but they couldn't grasp the true nature of what haunted me. Richard had died believing we'd made the archaeological discovery of the century. He never understood that what we'd found wasn't just ancient. It was alien in the deepest sense of the word, and perhaps the builders of that underground prison had been right to seal it away, to hide it from a world that wasn't ready to face such knowledge. Some things, I had learned, were buried for a reason.